Good morning, friends. Welcome to CEC live lecture series. And as you know, we've been running a series on world literature, and these days we are discussing and sharing with you perspectives on Latin American writing. And in this series, the next lecture is going to be on the poet Octavio Paz, who is well known to us in India, particularly to scholars and poets, and who wrote what can be called difficult poetry. So be prepared to get those questions, get those aspects of his writing a bit more alertly than is generally the case. For this lecture, we have Dr. Payal Nagpal, the subject expert with us, and she teaches English literature in Janki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University. She has worked extensively on world drama, on Indian drama, and on Indian writing. And today she will be talking on this topic, and I'm sure that there will be questions and there will be observations that you might share with us. For that, we have a facility in this series. We give 10 minutes to discussion towards the end of the lecture. The discussion can begin at 10:50, and there is a toll-free number that you can use for this. The toll-free number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, this number is 1-800-110-430. So with this, I request now Dr. Payal Nagpal. Welcome, Dr. Payal Nagpal, and please give your lecture.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. Today's lecture is on the poet, a Latin American poet, Octavio Paz, and he's basically a Mexican poet, and was born in 1914. So I'll begin by giving a few details about his life. It's the year of his birth is interesting because in a sense it's almost as if he enters the world of turmoil. So 1914 is also the outbreak of the First World War, and he lives right through the 20th century and dies in 1998. Now, he was the son of a lawyer, and he was the grandson of a novelist, political journalist, and lawyer. So in a sense, the idea of writing and law as a profession, these two things were something that Paz was exposed to. So his father was a counsel for the Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata, and so the idea of protest, the idea of ideas that question things around him, this is something that he had exposure to from the very beginning. He in fact came out with his first book when he was 19, called Savage Moon, and of course during the Spanish Civil War he went ahead and totally supported the cause. He attended the second International Congress of the Anti-Fascist Writers, and also found literary reviews like Taller and The Child Prodigy. He's also somebody who was involved in diplomat service, so from about 1946 to 1951, and where he traveled to Paris and he met Breton and so on. So going to Paris and meeting people like surrealists like André Breton was very, very significant, I think, because it is here that his exposure to a lot of movements of which Paris was the hub happened. So for instance, surrealism is something that he was exposed to, and was quite impressed with the surrealist artists and writers, because he felt that they saw something that was otherwise missing in the writers. So beyond reason, beyond rationality, there is another world. So how does one grapple with that world, and how does one reflect that in the process of writing? These are some of the questions that he confronted, and this was primarily through his interactions with people in other countries. He was greatly influenced during his service here in India as well. So when he visited India, this was from 1962 to 1968. And he was on some kind of as an ambassador. He was here in India, and he also traveled to Japan, so he also had exposure to the context of Asia. And it's interesting that he also got married to a woman in India. So he resigned from his service in 1968 because the Mexican government suppressed the students' rebellion in 1968, and so he was quite upset about that and felt that he, on his part, should not extend support to the Mexican government. Interesting aspects about his life, and one of them is that he studied law, but he left it before completion because like father and like grandfather, he too decided to study law, but he wanted to be a poet. So he did not complete his degree, and while his father was in political exile, the family moved to the US. And it's interesting to mark that where in the US he was seen as a Mexican and treated as an outsider. After that stay, when he came back to Mexico at the school level, his classmates would again see him as an outsider. So in a sense, this idea about humanity traversing boundaries and of different kinds of people, different kinds of civilizations, different aspects of it, these are some issues that were always there on his mind. And so this desire to actually look at the term humanity in a very, very broad context, I think would probably, the seeds of it would have been sown quite early. It's interesting that in one of the interviews he himself says that three writers that he was extremely influenced by. One is T.S. Eliot, and he was particularly impressed by The Wasteland, and he was greatly influenced by André Breton and St. John Perse. So I will begin by approaching Paz through one of his, what is known as his epic poem. I mean, it's the length of the poem is such that it can be, as critics often say, that it can be a full-length book. So it's a 584-line poem, and which is why it's called an epic poem. But it's not the sheer length alone that fits it under the head of the epic poem, but it is a poem that covers various aspects of life, and aspects of life through an intensity, through a passion that the poet understands and weaves into this poem. So that allows us to look at various aspects of life, various aspects of death, various aspects of survival, of freedom, of existence. A lot of these ideas, that were very, very important in the 20th century. So he approaches them through a kind of intensity, which can also be referred to a kind of pre-Columbian intensity. And when I say pre-Columbian, the idea is that, before the approach of Columbus, and what were the kind of civilizations that were there. So he goes back, in a sense, to the ancient forms to use words also that create those kind of the myths, the archetypes, and these are all part of Sunstone, as the poem is called. And again, if you look at the two words that make up this poem, it is sun and stone. So where sun is supposed to give life, it gives light, it is life-giving, it signifies energy. Stone signifies a kind of coldness, it signifies a kind of hardiness, and stone also signifies a kind of stasis. But then one thing common, in a sense, to both sun and stone, more to sun than to stone, of course, is this idea of outliving it all. The fact that, both the sun and, in a sense, the stone, they survive. And it is this element of, in a sense, disparate elements that Octavio Paz looks at through the context of his poetry. So this J.M. Cohen, interestingly, called Sunstone the last important poem to be published in the Western world. And the 584 line a bit is interesting, because in one of the interviews, Paz says that he probably exceeded the 584 limit, or maybe it was less, he wasn't sure, but he said that he brought it to 584 because this is the time taken by Venus to complete its full cycle as it moves around the sun. So we see that where, in a sense, because this is the cycle of Venus, a kind of scientific approach of rationality, of looking at the world objectively is there, and yet at the same time there is also this use of the intensity of the myth, and he's greatly influenced, in a sense, by the Maya civilization and the whole idea of the Aztecs. So the theme of this poem, as in many others actually, remains nature. But I mean, unlike the English romantics, for instance, who also kind of present nature as an important trope, here we are looking at nature in a very, very different manner. So where we talk about magic realism and so on in the context of Latin American writing, I think in Octavio Paz's poetry, we can easily see this use of magic realism, because there is so much that he's speaking, but the pattern of words that he presents it's a complex weave. So he talks about passion, he talks about death, existence, but most importantly the idea of humanity. So the poem begins with a kind of calmness. So I'll read out the first line of the poem. Calm course of the stars or an unhurried spring. So the fact that there is no hurry, there is a kind of calmness that is there to life, there is that is there to objects around, and this calmness is palpably sensed and felt in the presence of nature. This soon, however, gives way to a kind of darkness, and if we take a look at one of the lines from the early part of about the third or fourth stanza of the poem, it says, gloomy splendor of misery. And again, like the sunstone, the gloomy misery is looked at in terms of splendor. So gloomy splendor of misery, like a bird whose song can turn a forest to stone. So the idea that where forest again is supposed to be a green cover, is supposed to be life-giving, again this idea of the bird that survives in the forest is its song is almost as if it turns things to stone. So another very important idea is, here we can see the idea of contraries, the idea that two very, very different ideas are put together, and this is in a sense a very typical trait with Octavio Paz, and one can see it in other poems as well. So where we look at these different elements that are brought together in the same line, on the same plane, there is also the idea of the moment. And time in that sense is extremely important for Paz. So for instance, when he talks about the moment, he says that there is nothing in front of me, only a moment, salvaged from a dream, tonight of coupled images dreamed. While a little later he says, while time gallops away and pounding at the doors of my soul with bloodthirsty schedules. So the idea of dreaming, so at the beginning we saw a kind of unhurried calm that soon gave way to misery and a gloomy splendor. We look at the idea of time and how time has been looked at in the Sunstone. So there is nothing, he says, in front, it is only a moment. And when he uses the term moment, and when we look at Octavio Paz's comments on poetry and on life in general, time is extremely important for him. The sense of time and how the poet experiences time is very significant. So what is the idea of the present? What is the idea of the past? And what is the idea of the future? This, how it is palpably felt in the present moment, is very significant. So which is why time gallops away, pounding at the doors of my soul with bloodthirsty schedule. So there is a realization that time is moving very fast in a kind of 20th century modern world, yet at the same time, there is this idea of the dream and images that come to mind. So existence, with this I move on to another very important idea, which is that of existence. And when we look at his understanding of existence, again the existence is the existence of the individual. It is the existence of humanity in general, and how human beings live in this world, and what does it mean to live. So he says, there's no one, you're no one, a heap of ashes and a worn out broom. So and this is actually true for a lot of Latin American poetry, the idea being this sense of the finitude, in a sense, of life itself, the fact that life, human life, has a limited pattern to it, and it begins and it ends. So where at the base lies a very objective idea of things that are born, they grow and they die. Similarly, like human beings, they come into the world, there is a sense of time, which of course is experiential, it's objective, it's many things. So, but there is also the idea of existence. And so he says, there's no one, you are no one. But what? A heap of ashes and a worn out broom. So a little later he says, a black hole. And there at the bottom, the eyes of a girl who died 1,000 years ago. So the fact that you are only a moment in this larger pattern of existence, in this larger pattern of life is felt in these lines. And so he seeks a kind of, through these extremely different ideas that he's bringing out, he seeks a kind of unity. And the sense of unity is extremely important for him, because he strives to achieve that. Because at the same time, he does not let these different images lead to a kind of breakdown in the poem. He tries to collect all these fragments and put them together to move on to an idea of unity. And he says, we glimpse the unity we lost, the desolation of being man and all its glories, sharing bread and sun and death, the forgotten astonishment of being alive. So the idea of unity is again something that reflects, in a sense, on the astonishment of being alive. And a man might be desolate in all his glories and sharing bread, sun and death. So it is the idea of being alive. So here I would also request Professor Prakash to talk a little bit about these very his themes are very intriguing in a sense, and which is why I think Sunstone is referred to as a kind of epic poem.
Well, I would respond to your discussion in a very positive manner, because you have underlined some of the basic features of his poetry, and as you rightly suggest, that his poetry is steeped in the moment, which means he is a poet of the 20th century. He is a poet of the politics of the century. He is a poet of the humanity of the century. And the way he is selecting these topics and concerns, that way he talks in a very concentrated manner through his images. So I don't see many ideas here in the sense, that there are committed poets who express ideas, but there are images which induce people to think. And that is at the back of his mind. He shares his mind and his understanding through his images. And you rightly point out that he may have taken the influence from surrealism, and surrealism for him is a very strong component of writing. So I would very positively respond to your explanation of his poetry.
Yes, that's true that he is greatly influenced by surrealism and his meeting with Breton and so on. And also that if we look at the novel as a genre where magic realism finds its way, so there is a different kind of a kind of passion or a layered intensity.
In fact, I was wondering at this time when you are using the word magic realism for him, because it's a poet.
Yes.
And realism is a term that is generally connected with novel or fiction.
Yes.
But I think his imagination is novelistic, in the sense that if there are 10 images and those 10 images evoke different areas of life, then it becomes of the scope of the novel.
Yes, and I think magic realism would be a term aptly applied to Octavio Paz, for the reason that when we talk about him as a poet of the moment, so the way he actually weaves the past into the present. So for instance, the Aztecs, or this idea of Venus and using a 584 in a particular meter here. So all these things kind of go on to create a poem that is in the present moment, that contemplates and thinks about humanity at present.
Whatever is present, whatever is felt, whatever is experienced is a strong component of reality. And that reality, I think, turns him into a realist.
Yes.
And this realism has a very wide scope. So all these things come together, and his poetry starts making sense, even though he is using basically burning images.
Yes.
Images that affect not merely the ideas, but the very soul and the self of a person.
Yeah. That's true, because the images are very powerful. So, for instance, when we look at the ending, so he says that I dreamt the dreams of dreamless stones. And so he's dreaming, and he's dreaming of dreamless stones. The idea of stone as something stark, the idea of stone as something that is frozen, that is static, and does not have the kind of life-giving capacity that, for instance, sun has, if you look at the title. So the ending, he says, I dreamt the dreams of dreamless stones, and one by one the walls gave way. So this idea of stasis that he had built up, he now collapses that, because one by one the walls gave way. So if there are stones that have been used to indicate stasis, that stasis is gradually going to be made fluid. So he says, one by one the walls gave way, all of the doors were broken down, and the sun came burning through my forehead. So the dialectic, in a sense, which initially seems to be a kind of polarity, if you look at sunstone, so it seems like, there is a kind of polarity that is there. These are opposites, but there is a kind of dialectical connection that is weaved into these two ideas when at the end he says that, one by one the walls gave way, all of the doors were broken down, and the sun came burning through my forehead and pulled me out of myself to wake me from this animal sleep and its centuries of stone. So the two, in a sense, and the sun acts upon this idea and breaks the idea of the stasis, or the frozen state that is there.
How do you comment on the wall standing between the human being and the sun, and when they break down, then the dialectic begins, as you say?
Yes, and in fact that's the interesting part, because one of the things that's always on his mind is that, or what he calls, the word that he uses in his interview is fraternity. So the idea of fraternity, and fraternity of humanity, the idea that one has to accept, there might be differences, but people have to accept each other as human beings first.
So people are not bound by their country's identities.
Yes.
They are all universal. They connect with one another. Mexico, India, and France, they get together as parts of humanity.
Humanity, and these differing elements, in a sense, that he kind of builds up, and this opposition that he builds up, he himself, as I said, collapses it, because the idea is that these boundaries that are built up, these strong limits that are created, they don't hold ground. Finally, what is important is that the walls give way and all the doors are broken down. So the idea is to move towards a kind of existence that is conducive for everyone to live in. And so the sun came burning through my forehead, and the sun is the biggest life-giving element. So and it energizes, and so it came burning through, he says, my forehead, and pulled me out of myself to wake me. So which means that this state of opposition.
There are two cells. From myself, my life is pulled out.
Yes, I was just in fact saying that it means that, he says that from this animal sleep, it wakes me up from this animal sleep and its centuries of stone. So what it means is that genuine existence is to let all the doors collapse and the walls collapse, to open all the doors, because the state in which people have lived, what Octavio Paz is saying is that this is a state of stasis, and that stasis, or the frozen state, where we believe that only we have to live our lives within these margins, be it margins of countries or communities and so on. So he says that needs to be collapsed. And so the final image is very interesting. He says that a course of a river that turns, moves on, doubles back, and comes full circle, forever arriving. So the idea of change, the idea of movement, the idea of a kind of fluidity that is there.
And see the intensity of forever arriving.
Yes.
It will keep on arriving even after 1,000 years.
Yes, and that is what always grips Octavio Paz's mind, the idea that an individual's human life might have a certain, limitation to it, but life in general, the eternity of it all, is something that he focuses on.
Can you talk about definitions that we have, which are kind of walls in our life, and that he is critiquing?
So, according to him, any kind of belief that we have in terms of defining our boundaries, it can be anything. He says that boundary or that rigidity regarding that boundary. It could be related to a country, it could be related to a community, but he says, or a belief about anything. So he says that rigidity has to be done away with, because that rigidity only means that we are like stone. So we need the sun to strike us, we need the energy to strike us, so that we can do away with that frozen stasis in our life and let the river flow. So these three images, in a sense, kind of give a very interesting direction to this epic poem, where there is stasis, there is an element that is energizing, and the outcome is the flow of the river, which is forever arriving. So, and in an interview, he says of this poem, Sunstone, he says, "But the time of my poem is not the ritual time of the Aztec cosmogony, but humans." So he says, in fact, the reason he says this is because Sunstone has often been referred to, a poem, a 584-line poem that goes back to the Aztecs and the Mayan civilization and so on. He says, yes, he takes on from all that. That is there at the back of his mind, because the past is equally important for Octavio Paz. So he says the past is very important, but he says that humans, biographical time, he says that is very important for him. He says the time of my poem is not the Aztec calendar, but humans, biographical time, which is linear. And he had earlier kind of explained that time in this sense, in the theological sense, that we now think that there is a beginning and there is an end to things. He says actually there is a kind of a sense of eternity, of endlessness that is there. So he says it was a kind of review of my life, a resurrection of my experiences, my concerns, my failures, my obsessions. And he says about Sunstone that the poem was simultaneously an end and a new beginning. And I think for us, what is very important about the poet's comment here, that it was both an end and a new beginning, means it signifies not only the cycle of belief that, where one thing finishes, another begins, but also this idea about forever arriving. And this forever arriving points towards a tremendous potential in human beings to also forever arrive within themselves, to bring this change, and this idea of acceptance is forever arriving. So he says about Mexico in that sense, that yes, the temples, gods of pre-Columbian Mexico were a pile of ruins, but the spirit, he says, is very important. The spirit speaks of a language of myth, legend, social coexistence, popular art and customs. So we can see that in this one statement, he has brought together myth, legend, which kind of brings in the past, and social coexistence, the idea that people and human beings should learn to coexist with each other, and of course popular art.
Well, friends, with this discussion, which is halfway through, we'll come to the second part soon. We have become aware about the complexity and about the materiality of this poet called Octavio Paz from Mexico, and Dr. Payal Nagpal will continue with the discussion in the second part, which will begin soon. Thank you. Friends, welcome back to the second session of the discussion, and Dr. Nagpal will continue with her points that she started with. And before she starts making the point, let me request her to a bit explain the term that she used, that time is not cosmogony but human and biographical. What exactly did he mean by this, Dr. Nagpal?
Yes. So he says in one of his interviews, he says that the time of my poem is not the ritual time of the Aztec cosmogony, because the poem Sunstone has actually been looked at from that perspective. And people have said that, this is a 584 line poem which signifies the cycle of Venus. So which he says is the case, that he did keep it to 584 because of the cycle of Venus. But he says he is more interested, he may have taken on from the Aztec idea in the poem, but for him what is more important is the time of the humans, biographical time, and he looks at time, the understanding that time is linear, that it is moving on. So he tries to actually explore these ideas when he brings in the past, for instance, to the present moment through the idea of the Aztecs, or contemplates on human existence in the present moment.
Evolution of a human being's behavior from, let's say, childhood to maturity.
Childhood to maturity, or what does maturity mean? For instance, what is maturity for a human being, and this idea of moving forward. So what does moving ahead in time, really speaking, mean? And of course, he had received the Nobel Prize, and in his speech he had actually talked about this idea of poetic modernity. So, and that, really speaking, explains his concern with time, his concern with space. But for him, these are not philosophical ideas that belong to another realm, but these are ideas that concern human beings, and so he explores them from that point of view.
This is very true, very significant.
Very significant.
Yes.
So, and which is why he says that, for instance, the spirit is important, and the spirit speaks of a language of myth, legend, and social coexistence. So myth and legend are discussed, but they are important from the perspective of social coexistence. And the word here is again we must pay attention to the fact that it is not social existence alone, but of an individual, but it is social coexistence, how human beings learn to live with each other. And he says, as mentioned earlier, how T.S. Eliot's surrealist art really affected him, and he says he was keen to contemplate on, especially with surrealism. He said they focused on something that belonged to, that was on the other side of reason. And he said that he wanted to contemplate on the idea of freedom. Freedom was very important to him, and he's written a lot of poems and works related to this idea of freedom. And he says the dialectics of freedom and fate, and the phrase here is very important. The dialectics of freedom and fate is the theme of Greek tragedy and Shakespeare, which means that by looking at it from the point of view of fate, some very crucial questions regarding freedom are being raised by Paz. And he says that where Spanish theatre might have expressed it through Christian theology, but he says that when we talk about freedom, a very important issue that emerges is that of personal responsibility. So he says that this whole notion of a kind of dialectic that is there between freedom and fate it belongs to the great writers, the classic writers, and of course the world of Shakespeare. So poetry in that sense for him is a bridge between what he calls solitude and communion. And the solitude and communion here, these are not just used in the theological sense of it. Of course, they do indicate that communion in the Christian sense of it. But he explores solitude and communion also in terms of human beings. Again, and that is where the whole perspective shifts. It is this shift of perspective that Octavio Paz is able to bring out at every point of time. So he says that poetry is a bridge between solitude and communion, because the communion is amongst human beings, communion between human beings and nature, the world of the trees, the birds, animals, everybody around, and more importantly, human beings one to one with each other. So, which is why he moves on to the next idea, which is that of the fraternity. And he says, and I quote Octavio Paz here, I understood that real fraternity implies that you must accept the fact that your enemy is also human. And he says, when you understand that, you can no longer accept violence. So this is what Octavio Paz has said. He says, what is real fraternity? Real fraternity does not mean a state of conflict. Real fraternity means establishing humanity in the highest order. And for Octavio Paz, humanity of the highest order would imply to understand that your enemy, and enemy here is not a war front enemy, but he says enemy also in terms of somebody who differs, whose ideas are not your ideas. This is that your enemy is also human. And he says, when you understand this idea, then you will no longer accept violence in any form. This brings us to his next phase, which is, his phase where he writes a lot of poems on India, on Asia, and Eastern Slope, which has poems written between 1962 to 1968, especially during his stay here. He writes poems on, for instance, the tomb of Amir Khusro, the mausoleum of Humayun, the balcony that appears over the lanes and by-lanes of Old Delhi. He writes a poem for the painter Swaminathan. He has poems on Lodi Gardens, Udaipur, Mysore, Himachal Pradesh, and so on. So we can see the wide range from a poem like Sunstone. He moves on to this idea of understanding two things. One, space, and the other is architecture. And he would use also a word, the kind of geography that a place has. So space is very, very significant, and it occupies a very important position in Octavio Paz's poetry. So for instance, we have the balcony, as I said, it's like somebody pouring over the lanes, by-lanes, the maze, the kind of cultural confluence that is there in Old Delhi. Then he has a poem called The Tomb of Amir Khusro, and the great poet. And I just read out from this short poem. It begins like this: trees heavy with birds hold the afternoon up with their hands. And so the trees are, he doesn't simply say that the birds are perched on the tree, but the trees are heavy with birds. And so it gives us the image of fullness, the idea of life, the idea of completeness, and they hold the afternoon up with their hands. He of course goes on to describe Nizamuddin and Khusro, and he says that he says about Amir Khusro, he says, parrot or mockingbird, the two halves of each moment, muddy sorrow, voice of light, syllables, wandering fires, vagabond architectures, every poem is time and burns. So if we just look at the idea, is it when he says parrot or mockingbird, is he saying that is it mere imitation, or is it there is some genius there? And he says that two halves of each moment, sorrow is looked at as muddy sorrow, and he finally arrives at the understanding that this is the voice of light. So the kind of energy, the kind of positivity that we looked at the sun with in Sunstone, the same thing emerges here as Khusro is seen, that voice of light, and the syllables themselves become wandering fires. So whose syllables? The poets, or also for instance Khusro's own. And so vagabond architecture. So it is architecture of a totally different kind, and the vagabond here is also the idea of a kind of non-adherence to any fixity, of evolving something, that a style that could be very, very different. So every poem is time and burns. Similarly, in the mausoleum of Humayun, he says, to the debate of wasps, the dialectic of monkeys, twittering of statistics, it opposes. So it rises against all this, the debate of wasps, the dialectic of monkeys, twittering of statistics. So there is a lot that could be said here as to what the wasps or the monkeys or the twittering of statistics signify. So where where a multitude tries to capture this the ideas of Humayun, the mausoleum, in a specific manner, but he says it opposes.
I think the distinction that he makes between life of one kind and the work of mind on the other might give clue to the question that you are raising, because monkeys and parrots and all those things on one side, and there is an architecture.
Yes.
There is something that the human mind did, and the two are different, and their difference is to be understood, accepted, and that line is to be drawn. Because after all, there is a kind of hierarchy here of something much more valuable than something that exists.
Yes,
This
absolutely true. In fact, that's a point that I was just going to come to, because the next line, he says it opposes, and in brackets there is a very, very important line. It says, high flame of rose formed out of stone and air and birds, and time in repose above the water, silences architecture. The idea that this is a monument of beauty, and it rises against everything. There's a world, as you said, of the wasps, the monkeys, statistics. It opposes all this, and it rises, and this is silences architecture. That silence too not only has a language, but it also has an architecture, and it is something. It's kind of restoring dignity, in a sense, to the living and to the dead. So,
and this is the wealth, that human beings are created through art.
yes.
Of their own kind, after their own heart.
And also, I think, especially because if you look at this, these are two poems that are on the tombs. One is a tomb of Amir Khusro, and the other is a mausoleum of Humayun. So I think his concern with death. And the fact that how things live on through the human mind, even after death. So I think that is an idea.
So death is worked out.
That is, death is worked out. He's explored it. He's thought about it, and brought it within the purview of the poem.
So death ceases to be death when it enters the world of art.
Yes.
It becomes it has a kind of immortality.
And it has a kind of immortality, and it has a kind of language of its own, and it's given a form, and it's a form that rises above all else. So.
Very, very profound idea that he expresses in his poetry.
Because the whole notion of existence is so very important for him, that death particularly, and this is a concern in other poets also from Latin America. So he also writes this poem for the famous painter Jagdish Swaminathan. And so he says in the poem, for the painter Swaminathan, he writes, with a rag and a knife against the fixed ideas, against the bull of fear, against the canvas, against the void. So, again, just as architecture rises above, what life rises above all else, especially when it comes to the tombs, it speaks a language of its own. Similarly, he talks about the world of art and painting, and how it goes against the bull of fear or against fixed ideas. Art speaks in a way that nothing else does. These are not words that can be captured, but he talks about the poem is titled for the painter Swaminathan, that with a rag and a knife he just kind of goes ahead with his work, and he's against any kind of fixity. So he writes beautiful poems on the Lodi Gardens, Udaipur, Mysore, and what's important in all of these is that it's all filtered through a very unadulterated objective lens. He captures what he sees, and it filters through his mind, the mind of the poet, a mind that is very layered, and he's able to kind of capture the intensity that is there, in this context. And so he says that if I had to express my vision of India in a single image, he says, I would say that I see a white ruinous architecture, a powerful river, a huge tree, and in its shade a shape. And he says that shape could be anything, from a beggar, it could be a pile of stones, it could be anything. So, and in the context of India particularly, he finds how time had slowed down and space had become larger. So the temporal spatial context, which are very, very central, integral to Octavio Paz's poetry, is something that acquires.
Can you talk a bit more about the language outside human language? The language of stones, you say, language outside, human experience.
Yes. Because when we talk about language within a very confined sort of human experience, then we only look at it in terms of a world of actions, a world where constantly something is being done and something is being performed. But what he's talking about is a stasis that rises above all else and speaks a different kind of language. And this too is a language of great dignity. So for instance, the high flame of rose formed out of stone, and time in repose above the water, silence
And
is
stone has a
architecture.
language.
Stone has a language, and the architecture, the form, and because that stone has been molded in a particular form. So the people who have molded it in that form, they are also represented in this language.
And it's not audible to an ordinary person.
It is not
But the artist is able to take it out and show it to people.
In fact, what is very interesting is this contradiction that in talking about the tomb and so on, he is actually restoring them and bringing them to life. And
reconnecting them with history.
Yes, reconnecting
which is
them
left
with history,
behind.
which has been left behind. And the fact that they speak a language that cannot be ignored. So, this idea of time and space is also something that is important in these monuments, because they too belong to time, they too belong to space, and that cannot be taken away. So, and he says that, if we look at some of his comments in a sense in poetry, he says the poem is a premeditated act, but poetry flows from a psychic well related to language. So the depth is, the depth is, there's extreme intensity there, because what he's saying is that poetry flows from your innermost thoughts, and these are related to language. And he says that writing is a very painful process that requires huge efforts and sleepless nights. So there is what he calls anguish that is related to the process of writing, to the act of writing. And he is extremely critical of a certain change that he notices around him. So for instance, he says that the poem is a premeditated act and it flows from a psychic well related to language. But he says today, poetry is like a secret cult whose rites are celebrated in the catacombs, in the fringes of society. That poetry, he's disappointed to see that poetry does not occupy center space. He says consumer society and commercial publishers pay little attention to poetry. He says, I think this is one of society's diseases. And he makes a very important statement. He says, I don't think we can have a good society if we don't also have good poetry, which means that poetry is the essence of life. It belongs to life, it belongs to that world where each person is in a sense able to kind of capture his own understanding of the world, and everybody's understanding has to be part of that larger fraternity that Octavio Paz has been talking about. And for instance, he says that, if looking at North America and South America, so in his Nobel Prize speech, he talks about the contradictions. He says it's very interesting that the center for North America lies in England and the Reformation, whereas for the South, it's Spain, Portugal, and it's the Counter-Reformation. But yet at the same time, these different ideas that are put together, how they gel, because they have to belong to that world of humanity. This is going to be the fraternity that he's talking about. So, and he says that, to be a Mexican writer in that sense, he says, is to listen to the voice of the present. And so the present is very, very, important as far as Octavio Paz is concerned. And time, space, plurality of spaces, in fact, is what he calls it. So he says that the sense that real time is over there, he says, led to what he calls the expulsion of the present. And this for him is a very important moment. What does he mean by expulsion of the present? He means the understanding that when you continue to live only in the moment, ignoring a sense of history, is what he calls, is something that you live in. But the expulsion of the present, he says, is what led to the writing of poetry. The realization that you're part of that historical process where the past has to be brought into the present. It is very, very important. And this, he says, had a tremendous bearing on his writing of poetry, this expulsion of the present and his realization that, poetry is in love with the instant and seeks to relive it in the poem, thus separating it from sequential time and turning it to what he calls a fixed present. So he says that he talks about a kind of poetic modernity, and what he says is that there is an attempt to modernize countries, and the poetic idiom also, poetic modernity, emerges as a parallel to that. But he says that when he searched for poetic modernity, he did not find anything, but what he did find, and he did not find any grail, but what he did find was he crossed several wastelands. And so he says that it's important to go back, in a sense, a kind of circularity that he's talking about, and this circularity can be seen in his poetry also, where he begins from a certain point and he tries to arrive somewhere, but the circularity is not static. It's forever arriving, it's forever moving, because it is something that has humanity at its center. So
as an imagination, one can say that circularity every time is different, that it's a bigger circle, a smaller circle, it might have a different kind of curve.
Yes.
So every time it's going to change.
It's going to change.
So it will come back and go forward.
Yes, it will come back and go forward, because it in a sense it also takes the past with it. It takes the present moment with it, and decides how things are going to shape up in that present moment, keeping this sense of historicity in mind.
And one more thing, you said something about difference between social existence and social coexistence.
Yes.
So what exactly is social coexistence?
So this is what
this was the crux, I
yes.
thought, of your argument.
When we understand Octavio Paz, I think this is very, very important, because he talks about Mexico in this sense and says that pre-Columbian Mexico, he talks about it, how it was, he speaks of a language of myth and legend, but along with myth and legend, he talks about social coexistence, because what is central to Octavio Paz is this idea of humanity, fraternity, his notion that you have to understand that even if there is somebody who differs in his ideas, that person is also human. So it is not enough that you exist in the world, but you have to learn to coexist with people around you.
Even a group may have a logic of existence, but this group is not integrated the way it should be within coexistence.
Yes.
So just society will not mean much. Society has to be interactive within itself.
Yes. And a kind of spirit, organicity that he's talking about, where all these different ideas, and he says that's the beauty of existence. The fact that we are able to, for instance, if one looks at it in the context of Mexico, the bringing of the pre-Columbian past, in a sense, to the present moment. He says similarly, the past impacts, influences, impulses of human beings, and how they are to be looked at in the present moment. So everything coalesces under one word, that I can say that he uses very often, is that of fraternity.
It's a very sharp humanistic statement.
Yes. Yes.
And
Octavio Paz certainly, kind of believes in this, and I think almost everything every poem that he's written kind of takes into account this idea of the fraternity, idea of humanity. And in fact, if we look at this concern with existence, there are other poets also, for instance, the Chilean poet Gabriela Mistral, who actually was involved in a lot of educational reforms in Mexico. She too, she was actually the first Latin American to get the Nobel Prize in 1945. And she too, like Octavio Paz, was an educator, a diplomat, and so on. And she too, of course, much earlier, but like Paz, she talked about the admirable work of freeing a tradition from deadwood, while conserving intact the core of old virtues, the acceptance of the present, and the anticipation of the future. So these are, which is why I said that, if we can use a word like magic realism in the context of poetry, it would be for Octavio Paz. This idea of existence, this idea of a layered understanding of the world is there. And earlier than Paz, you have poets like Gabriela Mistral, who've pretty much talked about these issues in a similar manner. So, freeing tradition from deadwood, and again, acceptance of present and anticipation of the future. In the Latin American context, this idea of time and space is perceived in a very different manner, and with a kind of complexity that is hard to find, which is why the term magic realism to this kind of poetry would be very, very apt.
No, in the sense that there are other poets in Latin America who will be also concerned with let's say freedom, death, with time, and that there is a kind of coalition of interests in the cultural sense among these poets, and that they together form a kind of entity that's going to be interventionist, that's going to be educative, as you say. That is a kind of framework, and that framework is available to us through their different poetic voices. So, would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. So, for instance, even Mistral through very, very short poems at times says a lot. For instance, there's a poem called Tiny Feet. So she says, a child's tiny feet, blue with cold. How can they see and not protect you? Oh my God. And she later says, a child's tiny feet, two suffering little gems, how can the people pass unseen?
So people see the child, they are not simple categories.
Pain and the cold, how this child is just lying there. It's in a sense also indicative of what is happening in the world around.
And nature comes in.
Nature comes in.
Human beings, being guided by, or being controlled by, or being inspired by nature.
Yes.
So all this is there common to the other poets and to this one.
Yeah.
Which may not be the case with the places in the rest of the world, because the Latin American poetry addresses itself to the elements, to the sea, to nature in general.
Yes.
And from there it draws lessons for humanity.
Yes, and I would also like to add that the kind of poetic idiom that evolves in the Latin American context is markedly different from the way it does in other places, because the way they perceive and string it together, that kind of realism is very, very different and extremely humanitarian, of course.
So friends, from this lecture we have understood a few important things. One is that Latin American voices in poetry are distinct, and they appeal to the audience, and they give the message in very clear terms of fraternity, of belonging one to the other, and that human beings can live in peace, can live in a kind of togetherness, and they can constitute in fact the whole humanity on this planet. And this vision is very inspiring for the rest of the poets in different parts of the country, and Latin America as a place where poetry also is written from with great engagement is something that we have to learn from. So I think we have had a very important, meaningful discussion in today's session, and there will be questions and other things that will be occurring in your minds, and please go over them, try to relate your own experiences with them, and then we come to the end of this. Thank you, and thanks Dr. Payal Nagpal for this wonderful lecture.
Thank you.